Agna threw on a dark cloak, its heavy fabric enveloping her figure. Easily opening the wooden door, she stepped into the garden bathed in bright daylight. It was filled with the aromas of summer flowers, and sunlight pierced through the dense crowns of trees, casting whimsical shadows on the ground. She walked along familiar paths and reached the back gate, careful not to let the rusty hinges creak. Stepping beyond the estate, she felt a slight relief, as if her father's mansion was a cage from which she had temporarily escaped. The path leading into the forest was covered with fallen leaves and branches that crunched under her feet. Under the cloak, she wore armor that somewhat restricted her movements, but it was a familiar weight, a part of her secret life. The iron and leather rubbed against her skin, reminding her of her dream and the necessity of keeping it hidden. The forest was quiet and bright, with sunlight breaking through the thick foliage, creating a play of light and shadow on the ground. The leaves whispered under the gentle breeze, and the path, well trodden by her many times, led her to her cherished destination. Soon, Agna emerged onto a small glade surrounded by tall oaks. In the center stood a training dummy, a simple wooden post wrapped in straw and cloth. She shrugged off her cloak, fully revealing her armor. The sunlight glided over the metal, giving it a sinister gleam. Agna drew her sword and began her exercises with quick and precise strikes slicing through the air. Each swing, each thrust was filled with hidden fury and despair. In her mind, the dummy transformed into her fiancé, a fat and lazy youth, the son of Count Greaves. The mere thought of him disgusted her. He was younger than her, weak and spoiled, lacking ambition and spirit. She hated him, but they were being forced to marry. The wedding was to take place the day after tomorrow, and this thought robbed her of peace. Every strike of the sword expressed her hatred and disappointment. She imagined what it would be like to be free if her life weren't predetermined by others' decisions. Her dream had always been to become a knight, to fight in tournaments and protect the kingdom. But reality was cruel. She couldn't go against her father's will, against social norms and expectations. She was a prisoner of her destiny, and her swords were the only outlet for her soul. Soon she grew tired and decided to rest. Stopping, she removed her heavy armor and sat on the grass, feeling her muscles ache from the strain. After sitting for a while, she stood up and wandered through the forest, her thoughts beginning to drift. Her whole life flashed through her mind like a whirlpool of memories. Her father had always treated her well, but as soon as her childhood ended, talks of marriage began. She was only 16, and she hadn't yet had a chance to know the world, but they already wanted to marry her off to some monster. She hated the thought, feeling like a commodity ready for sale. Walterus, her fiancé, the son of Baron Greaves, was younger than her, fat and spoiled, devoid of any ambitions or spirit. Not noticing how her feet had led her to the edge of an abyss, she suddenly stopped. It was a huge pit, 10 feet in diameter, plunging deep into the ground. It was surrounded by a fence of stones to prevent anyone from accidentally falling in. Its depth seemed endless, and many said this hole led straight to hell. Others claimed that evil spirits lived there, so no one dared to come close. Once, a merchant suggested using this pit as a waste dump. Agna's father, upon learning of this, almost beheaded him. In their family, it was passed down from generation to generation that this place should not be disturbed. But lately, Agna had often noticed her brother Edmund here. He was mean and selfish, often picking on her in childhood. In recent months, he had started giving her strange looks, as if seeing in her not a sister, but something else. He had become distant, whispering to himself when he thought no one was listening. Agna approached the edge of the pit and looked down. She saw only darkness, as if the abyss itself was swallowing the light. Sighing, she recalled how her brother once nearly pushed her into it when they were children, laughing his cruel laugh. Now his strange behavior scared her even more. She wondered what attracted him here. Perhaps he was searching for something in this darkness, or maybe he was connected to the ancient legends surrounding this place. Agna felt a chill down her spine and stepped back from the edge. Suddenly, she heard a noise, and her attention shifted from the abyss's darkness to the forest. From the dense thicket emerged a strange company. Leading the way was a tall knight, so tall that Agna would have called him a giant. He was clad in black armor and a helmet that seemed to absorb sunlight, giving him a menacing appearance. A dark gray cloak billowed behind him. He carried a travel bag on his shoulder and a massive sword on his back, which seemed disproportionately large even for his enormous size. Beside the knight ran a small animal the size of a dog, resembling a wolf, but with a pair of horns on its head. Its fur was an unusual blue shade, making it even more mysterious. The animal frolicked around the knight, wagging its tail cheerfully. Behind the knight rode an old man on a donkey. The old man wore a straw hat and sat confidently in the saddle despite his blindness, indicated by scars where his eyes once were. He had a broad, cunning smile, giving him the appearance of a merry sage. The old man laughed loudly and talked to the donkey as if it could understand him. The knight, on the other hand, constantly grumbled and twitched strangely, as if he wanted to scratch himself but couldn't in his armor. The heavy metal plates seemed uncomfortable, perhaps unbearable for constant wear. Agna found it odd that he wore them all the time. Who could they be, she wondered. Richard wearily trudged through the forest. The past few days had not been pleasant. They had passed through several villages in search of work, but luck was not on their side. Money was running out, and Balthazar had to sell his cart. He shed many tears parting with it, but it helped them for a while. The old man hadn't let go of Richard and accompanied him everywhere despite his protests. They continued their journey, heading south. One day, in one of the villages, they decided to treat themselves and spend the night in an inn, using the money from selling the cart. It turned out to be a mistake, as the bed was apparently infested with fleas that moved onto the knight overnight, constantly bothering him. This amused the old man, who kept laughing at him. When Richard, angry and irritated, asked why the fleas hadn't infested him too, the old man only smirked. "I am bald, and besides, I can use magic to create a barrier that destroys them," Balthazar replied and asked, "By the way, why can't you use magic?" Richard didn't respond. He had learned light magic, but it conflicted with his wolfish nature. He didn't know any other magic. "Do you want me to teach you?" Balthazar offered. Richard reluctantly agreed, thinking it might work. The old man gave him a few lessons, but so far nothing had worked. Along the way, Richard kept practicing. They continued their journey, and one day, while searching for prey, they ventured deeper into the forest and discovered the corpses of monsters. It was strange. They wondered what could have happened here. The bodies looked fresh, and there were no signs of a struggle or tracks of other creatures around them. As they surveyed the area, they noticed movement in the bushes. Expecting to see what it might be, they saw a puppy emerge. It was strange, possibly the offspring of a monster. Surprisingly, the puppy immediately attached itself to Richard, as if he were its mother. He didn't want to take it with them, but the old man began to persuade him, saying it would be useful to him. Richard refused, so Balthazar began to care for the animal himself. Since then, Enzio, as the old man named him, had become their companion, irritating the knight with his constant barking. Soon they came upon another village and heard that Count Graydons was holding a tournament in honor of his daughter's wedding. The prize was 1,000 crowns, a huge sum that would allow them to forget about their travel expenses. They headed toward the Count's estate, hoping for luck. As they emerged from the forest, Richard noticed a young girl in armor standing by a stone fence holding a sword. It surprised him. He approached the stone fence that bordered a huge hole in the ground. The stones were old, covered with moss and dust, testifying to their long existence. He then leaned over the edge and looked down. Cold, damp air rose from below, carrying the smell of moisture and decay. The deep darkness swallowed the light, making it seem like the bottom of the hole was infinitely far away. Richard felt as if he was being drawn into the abyss. Taking his gaze off the abyss, he addressed the stranger. "What are you doing here, young lady?" His voice sounded gruff, but his eyes showed more interest than he wanted to reveal. The girl lifted her head and met his gaze. "I'm just resting," she replied, trying to hide her anxiety. "And you? Who are you?" "We are travelers," Balthazar intervened, smiling cheerfully. "Looking for work and a bit of luck. This place seems quite interesting to us. I am a servant of the goddess of the moonlit night, Balthazar, and this knight is Sir Richard." "My name is Agna," she said, bowing. Richard couldn't help but notice her fatigue and despair, hidden behind a brave exterior. Enzio, sensing the change in mood, stopped barking and approached the girl, sniffing her and wagging his tail. The girl smiled and knelt down, petting him on the head. "His name is Enzio," Richard said, softening for the first time. "It seems he likes you." "He's wonderful," she replied, looking at the puppy. Then she stood up and looked at them, asking, "Are you heading to the estate?" Richard answered, "We want to sign up for the tournament. Could you show us the way?" She nodded, sighing. "The path is simple. You need to go straight through the forest to the large oak grove, then turn right. There will be a wide trail leading to the estate. But if you want, I can show you the way." Richard bowed in gratitude. "If you have time, it would be very kind of you." Agnes smiled. "No problem. Follow me." Before they set off, Richard glanced at the hole again. He felt a strange sensation, as if a call was coming from the abyss. A shiver ran down his spine, as if the darkness itself was whispering unknown words to him. For a moment, he couldn't take his eyes off the bottomless darkness. "Hey, are you coming?" Balthazar sharply asked, pulling Richard out of his reverie. Richard flinched and looked away from the hole. "Yes, I'm coming," he said, trying to shake off the strange feeling. They followed the girl knight through the forest. It was full of sounds, birds chirping, leaves rustling underfoot, and a light breeze playing in the tree crowns. Soon, Agna stopped. "Wait a minute," she said, and rushed into the bushes. After a while, she returned with a helmet on her head. Apparently, she wanted to hide her identity. "Let's continue," she said, and the company moved forward again. They emerged onto a road where many people were walking. The road was wide and well-trodden, surrounded by lush trees and shrubs. People walked in groups, some leading carts, others carrying bags and bundles. The atmosphere was lively, filled with conversations and laughter. Soon they approached Count Graydon's estate. It was a large, majestic building surrounded by high stone walls. The gates were open, and a steady stream of people flowed through them. The estate grounds housed numerous buildings and beautiful gardens with fountains and statues. Agna confidently led them to one of the buildings where the tournament registration was located. A line of people wanting to sign up stood at the entrance. Some were in armor, others in simple clothes, but all were filled with determination and hope for victory. "Here is the registration," Agnes said, pointing to the building. "You'll need to wait in line." Richard bowed to her again in gratitude. "Thank you for your help, my lady. We would have searched for the road much longer without you." Agnes nodded. "Glad to help. Good luck in the tournament." As they approached the registration desk, they heard the sound of trumpets and the noise of the crowd. People buzzed with excitement, passing on the news that the Baron had arrived with his son and retinue. Upon hearing this, Agnes turned pale. "I need to go," she quickly said, and not waiting for a response, hurried off into the crowd. Richard and Balthazar exchanged glances and decided to see who had arrived. They moved to the main road, where a crowd of onlookers had already gathered, trying to catch a glimpse of the Baron and his entourage. The procession was impressive. Heralds led the way, blowing golden trumpets announcing the arrival of an important person. Behind them followed a group of well-armed guards in shining armor, their helmets glinting in the sun. They moved with pride and confidence, clearing the way for their lords. In the center of the procession rode Baron Haemon Greaves himself. He was a large, imposing man with gray hair and a beard, dressed in rich clothing adorned with his house's emblems. The emblem was magnificently embroidered on his cloak, a silver griffin on a crimson background holding a golden sword with 3 black stars above it. Next to him rode his son, Walterus Greaves, a young man with an arrogant expression. He was dressed in expensive clothes, but his appearance was pampered. He was fat and unprepossessing. In the young man's eyes, there was neither strength nor determination, only vanity and smugness. He looked at the crowd with a haughty smirk, clearly enjoying the attention. With them rode a huge knight in black armor, striking fear into everyone who saw him. One of the onlookers asked, "Who is that?" Another replied, "That's the personal guard of the Baron's son, Noguchi, known as the Black Titan." As the procession passed by, Noguchi glanced at Richard. Their eyes met for a moment, and Richard felt a chill run down his spine, as if that look penetrated his very soul. The knight seemed to be assessing him as a rival, but then turned away, as if deeming him unworthy of attention. When the guests left, the crowd dispersed, and Richard went to register. He stood in line, and, after waiting for some time, registered. The tournament was to begin the next morning, and he had little time to prepare for the trials ahead. After looking around the estate a bit, they headed towards the nearby village. The village was in festive chaos, preparing for the wedding of the Count's daughter. The streets were decorated with garlands and ribbons, and the houses with bright flowers. The air was filled with the smell of fresh pastries and roasted meat, which whetted the travelers' appetites. Crowds of people, including knights, merchants, and guests, filled the streets. There was joy and excitement everywhere, children running and playing, while adults discussed the upcoming events. Passing by a bustling square, the travelers heard a village woman with a concerned face walking among the people asking, "Have you seen my husband? He went missing this morning and hasn't returned?" Her voice trembled with worry. They moved further and noticed several other people searching for their relatives. A woman with a small child in her arms loudly asked, "Has anyone seen my brother? He was here yesterday, but I haven't seen him since." Another person, an old man with a cane, was asking passers-by about his son. Despite the festive atmosphere, these troubling moments did not go unnoticed. Richard paid attention to the worried faces and the whispers among the people, but it seemed that most villagers and guests were trying not to give it much thought, absorbed in the preparations for the celebration. Strange, Richard said as they left the village. Why is no one paying attention to the disappearances? Perhaps the celebration overshadows common sense, Balthazar replied. People prefer not to think about bad things, especially when there's fun ahead. They decided not to stay in the village and left its bounds. Finding a secluded spot among the trees, they set up a small camp. Setting up for the night, they lit a fire to warm up and cook dinner. Night gradually enveloped them, and only the crackling of the fire disturbed the silence. Richard sat by the fire trying to use magic as the old man Balthazar had shown him. But nothing worked despite his efforts. He concentrated, trying to feel the energy flows, but it was all in vain. The old man noticed his struggle and sat down next to him. "Do you know about the different types of magic?" Balthazar asked. Richard shook his head. In the Order of Light, they weren't told about other types of magic, considering them heresy. The old man nodded and continued. There are several types of magical energy in the world. The first is general magic, which most people can use. For example, light magic and moon magic. There's also dark magic. It doesn't require a special lineage and can be used by anyone, depending on their worldview and personal qualities. Then there's innate magic, which is rare and passed down through generations. Finally, there's curse magic. It has its own peculiarities. Your curse limits you, and you can't use light magic. But I think you should be able to use moon magic freely. Richard looked at the scars where the old man's eyes used to be and realized that he could see, but in a different way. Balthazar raised his hand and, opening his palm, concentrated. A white flame appeared on his hand, emitting cold rather than heat. Just focus and absorb the energy of the moon, then mentally direct it into your palm, the old man said. Richard focused and finally felt the particles of energy. The more he absorbed, the better he felt. It seemed like the energy began to flow into him like a river. Then he opened his palm, and a flame appeared, starting to grow, overshadowing everything around. Balthazar was frightened and shouted at him to stop, but there was a flash that lit up everything around. Cries of people, frightened by the bright light, echoed around. To Richard's surprise, the old man was joyful. "I knew you had a predisposition for this type of magic," he said, but didn't have time to finish as the guards arrived. He had to deal with them, explaining that he was a monk of the goddess of the moonlit night. And in the end, he bribed them, spending the remaining money. Richard sat with an apologetic expression, but the old man just waved it off. "Don't worry," Balthazar said. "This was important. Now I'll teach you the next technique." The old man raised his staff and pointed at Richard's sword. "Moon magic can be used to create a glowing sword. Focus on your palm as you did before and absorb the energy. Then direct it not just into your palm, but into your weapon." Richard closed his eyes and concentrated. He felt the moon's energy flow through his body and into the sword. The sword began to emit a soft light, growing brighter. Richard opened his eyes and saw his sword glowing with a silver light as if illuminated by the moon. "Now strike," Balthazar said. Richard raised his sword and struck the air. The glowing sword left a luminous trail, as if cutting through the air itself. The concentrated energy in the sword was released, and Richard felt its power. "Not bad," Balthazar said, pleased with the result. "This is just the beginning. With this power, you can achieve a lot. Now rest. Tomorrow we have a tournament." Richard nodded, smiling gratefully at the old man. He felt he had made progress in his training and was ready for the upcoming challenges. The next day, early in the morning, they headed to the estate, where the arena for the tournament was set up. It was located on a spacious clearing, surrounded by high stands decorated with flags and noble house crests. In the center of the arena was a large fighting area covered with sand. Around the perimeter of the arena were spectacular shields and weapons prepared for the participants. Crowds of people filled the stands, their excited voices merging into a continuous hum. Knights, merchants, peasants, and noble guests had gathered from all over the kingdom to witness this grand event. The atmosphere was tense and full of anticipation. Richard headed to the arena to prepare for his first battle, while Balthazar took a seat in the stands to watch the tournament. The old man watched the proceedings with interest, clearly hoping to see his student showcase his abilities. The start of the tournament was marked by the appearance of a herald dressed in a bright, richly adorned costume. He stepped into the center of the arena and raised his hand, calling for silence. "Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this magnificent tournament held by Count Greddens in honor of his daughter's wedding," the herald loudly announced. "Today we will witness great battles and noble feats. Warriors from all over the kingdom have gathered here to demonstrate their strength, agility, and courage." The herald paused, allowing the crowd to express their approval with loud applause and cheers. Then he continued, "The rules of the first round are as follows. 89 knights will fight each other in a survival match until only 8 remain. These 8 chosen ones will continue their struggle in the second round. Another important rule in the first round is that magic is prohibited. Remember, honor and valor are what matters in this tournament." With these words, the knights began to enter the arena, ready for battle. Among them was Richard, his armored figure standing out against the other participants. He felt excitement and adrenaline filling him. The crowd roared, cheering for their favorites, and the atmosphere was electric. Richard was ready for his first trial, and despite all the hardships, he knew this was his chance to prove his strength and achieve victory. When the signal to start the fight sounded, the arena filled with the clash of metal and the cries of battling knights. Each participant sought to demonstrate their valor and skill, but also understood the importance of staying alive. Richard, due to his imposing size and powerful build, immediately drew attention. Most knights tried to avoid him, fearing a direct confrontation. For a while, Richard simply stood in the center of the arena, assessing the situation and observing his surroundings. His gaze darted from one opponent to another, searching for weaknesses and possible threats. He was ready for battle, but knew that hasty actions could lead to defeat. Suddenly, several knights attacked him at once. 3 opponents charged at him from different sides in a coordinated assault. Richard reacted instantly, dodging one knight's strike and blocking another's sword with his shield. The third knight tried to strike him from behind, but Richard turned swiftly, delivering a crushing blow to the knight's chest, knocking him off his feet. He managed to fend off the first attack, but the enemies did not retreat. Richard used his physical strength and agility to deal with the attackers. He moved quickly and confidently, blocking blows and delivering his own with powerful precision. One knight attempted to approach him from behind, but Richard noticed and swiftly turned, striking the opponent to the ground. After dealing with the initial attackers, Richard began actively seeking out opponents. He moved across the arena, challenging those who seemed worthy adversaries. His movements were powerful and precise, each strike calculated and deadly. Opponents who faced him quickly realized they couldn't withstand his strength and agility. The fight continued, and time flew by unnoticed. An hour later, when the final signal sounded, Richard stood among the few remaining. He was drenched in sweat, his armor covered in dust and scratches, but he felt satisfied with his victory. The crowd roared, applauding the remaining knights and expressing their admiration for their skill. Richard, breathing heavily, looked around. 8 knights, including himself, were left standing. He knew there were many trials ahead, but the first step was taken. Among them he noticed Noguchi, whom he had seen earlier, realizing he might face him later. After the first round ended, the knights were given a short break. During this time, actors came onto the arena to entertain the crowd with a theatrical performance. It was a spectacle full of magic and wonder. The actors played scenes from legends and myths, telling stories of ancient heroes and great deeds. Magical illusions created by the troupe's magicians appeared on stage. Giant dragons made of light and shadow, knights in shining armor, beautiful fairies, and monsters. Lights shimmered and danced in the air, creating an atmosphere of enchantment. One actor conjured magical fire, which turned into birds, soaring above the arena, and disappeared in clouds of sparks. The crowd was delighted, their applause and cheers unceasing. When the performance ended, the herald returned to the arena to announce the start of the second round. The participants drew lots to find out their opponents. Richard drew number 7, and his opponent drew number 1. Richard stepped onto the arena, and the crowd cheered, welcoming him. He felt adrenaline fill his body again, preparing for the new fight. His opponent was a short man dressed in green armor. He had a thin saber that gleamed in the sun. The fight began, and the opponent immediately showed his agility, easily dodging Richard's attacks. He moved quickly and gracefully, almost like dancing, while his saber flashed like lightning. Richard realized that this fight would require more than just strength. Suddenly, the opponent began using wind magic. Dust rose, reducing visibility in the arena. Richard could barely make out silhouettes and only heard the whistle of the wind and the rustle of steps. The opponent used magic to attack stealthily, delivering quick strikes and then disappearing in the dust cloud. Richard focused, relying on his senses. He understood that wind magic was his opponent's advantage, but he also knew that his own agility and intuition could help him win. He closed his eyes and listened to the sounds around him, trying to catch the slightest movements. The opponent attacked again, but Richard managed to dodge in time, sensing the incoming strike. He used his physical strength and agility to counterattack. His blows were powerful and precise, and each time he got closer to his opponent. Finally, he caught the moment when the opponent made a mistake. Swinging his sword, Richard delivered a powerful blow, knocking the saber from his opponent's hands. The opponent lost his balance and fell to his knees. Richard stood over him, his sword at the ready, but did not deliver the final blow. The crowd exploded with applause and cheers, celebrating Richard's victory. He helped his opponent to his feet, showing respect for his skill and agility. The herald announced him the winner, and Richard felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. After the first fight ended, the duels continued in the arena. Richard watched his future opponents, evaluating their strength and technique. His attention was particularly drawn to one knight, Noguchi, who defeated his opponent almost instantly. This impressed Richard, and he realized this warrior would be a serious contender. An hour later, Richard faced his second fight. As he stepped onto the arena, he saw his opponent, a knight from the Graydon's family, known for his skill and ruthlessness in battle. This knight, named Sir Edmund, was tall and muscular, with a stern expression. His armor was adorned with the Graydon's family crest, a black boar on a gold background, symbolizing their strength and power. Richard had seen Sir Edmund fight before and knew he was a formidable opponent. The fight began and the crowd roared with excitement. Edmund attacked first, his strikes powerful and precise. Richard dodged and blocked, trying not to make any mistakes. The battle was fierce. They exchanged blows, their swords clashing with a deafening clang. Each of them tried to find a weak spot in the other's defense. Edmund was incredibly strong and agile, and Richard felt this fight would be a tough challenge. Suddenly, Edmund made an unexpected maneuver, circling Richard and delivering a strong blow to his shield. Richard staggered but quickly regained his balance and counterattacked, forcing Edmund to step back a few paces. The crowd held their breath, watching their every move. Suddenly, Richard felt his body stiffen. He couldn't move, as if trapped by invisible chains. His heart raced, realizing he was under the effect of paralyzing magic. Edmund, seeing this, quickly rushed towards him with his sword at the ready. This could be the end for Richard. Gathering all his strength, Richard focused and began channeling the magic. He felt the moon's energy fill his body, giving him the power to break free. At the last moment, when Edmund's sword was within striking distance, Richard managed to break free and deflect the attack. The stands erupted with cheers, thrilled by the spectacle. Richard counterattacked, delivering powerful blows. Suddenly, he noticed his opponent's sword turn black, and he felt dark magic emanating from it. Due to the rising dust, others didn't notice, but Richard realized he had to act quickly. He focused on moon magic. Though weaker during the day, he felt a surge of energy. Concentrating, he directed the magic into his sword, which glowed with a silver light. Richard struck with the glowing sword, and icy energy enveloped his opponent. Sir Edmund was frozen and thrown back, falling unconscious. His helmet fell off, and Richard saw his face, along with a tattoo on his neck, a black circle with a red diamond shaped like an eye. Richard recalled where he had seen that tattoo before and had a bad feeling. The crowd roared in delight, but Richard felt uneasy. He stood and headed toward the exit, sensing that there was more to this fight than met the eye. After Richard's victory, the arena continued to come alive with new battles. Noguchi won his next fight, and his victory was as impressive as the first. The crowd applauded his skill, and Richard understood that this warrior would be his main opponent in the final. After some time, the herald came out again and announced the beginning of the final match. Richard felt a slight nervousness, knowing his opponent was incredibly strong. As they stepped onto the arena, the crowd roared in anticipation. Noguchi was a tall, robust warrior with a stern expression. His armor was black with silver embellishments, and his eyes gleamed with determination. He held a massive sword that looked heavy enough to fell any opponent. The fight began, and Richard made the first move, attacking his opponent. Their swords clashed with a deafening ring, and Richard immediately understood how strong his opponent was. Noguchi skillfully dodged attacks and delivered powerful strikes. Each one felt through Richard's armor. Suddenly, Richard was struck in the side and crashed to the ground. Pain shot through his body, but he gritted his teeth and stood up, determined to continue the fight. The crowd held its breath, watching their every move. The battle was fierce. Noguchi continuously landed powerful blows, repeatedly knocking Richard down. Only his sturdy armor and strong body saved him, enduring incredible stress. Richard knew he had to find a way to turn the tide of the fight. He caught a moment and used moon magic to freeze his opponent. Icy energy enveloped Noguchi, freezing him in place. But he was so powerful that he broke free from the icy shackles and knocked Richard to the ground again. Noguchi didn't use overt magic, but his strength and agility were clearly beyond human capabilities. Perhaps he was using body enhancement magic. Richard repeatedly used moon magic, but he couldn't break through his opponent's defenses. He kept getting hit, beaten like a rag doll. It seemed the outcome of the fight was clear, but each time he received a powerful blow, his rage grew stronger. Suddenly, he felt an unfamiliar red energy envelop him, strengthening his body and spirit. This new power gave him an adrenaline rush. His strikes became more powerful and precise, and even his opponent noticed the change. The fight continued with renewed fury. Richard attacked with incredible strength, and his blows finally began to break through the defense. Finally, Richard used all his strength and magic to deliver the decisive blow. Red energy enveloped his sword, and he struck his opponent forcefully, knocking him to the ground. Noguchi fell, stunned and unconscious. The crowd exploded with applause and cheers, celebrating Richard's victory. He stood, breathing heavily, as the rage and energy that had enveloped him gradually dissipated. When the fight ended, the herald came onto the arena and loudly announced, "The winner of the tournament is Sir Richard." The crowd erupted in applause and joyful cries. Richard stood, breathing heavily, but filled with pride and determination. The herald invited him to the Count to receive his prize. The viewing box was adorned with rich fabrics and family crests. The Count sat in the center, majestically reclining on a carved chair with high backs. He was a middle-aged man with piercing eyes and a stern expression. His clothing was richly decorated, and the family crest of Greddens, a black boar on a gold background, gleamed on his chest. Next to the Count sat his son, a young man with an arrogant gaze. He was dressed in expensive clothes that emphasized his status. His eyes were cold and impassive. On the other side of the Count sat his daughter, the very night girl Richard had met in the forest earlier. This surprised him. She was in an elegant dress, and in her eyes he saw despair. Also in the box was Baron Greaves with his son. He looked stern and serious, while his son had a sneering expression, clearly displeased with the proceedings. Count Greddens stood up and handed Richard a pouch of money, thanking him solemnly. "Sir Richard, you have proven your valor and skill. Congratulations on your victory." The crowd erupted in applause again, and Richard felt pride swell within him. Leaving the box, he went to find Balthazar and soon found him. The old man, smiling, approached him and said, "Congratulations, Richard. You deserve this." Richard handed him the pouch of money, and the old man joyfully tucked it away. In the evening, Richard wandered through the village. The festive atmosphere still hung in the air, but he noticed a large crowd gathered near the town hall gates. Approaching closer, he heard people demanding the guards investigate the disappearance of their relatives. This time, more people had gone missing, and the crowd was worried. The guards refused to do anything, saying that the people were probably just out celebrating somewhere. Richard didn't like this, and he felt something was wrong. He continued walking and didn't notice how his feet led him to the very abyss he had seen earlier. It was already night, and in the moonlight he saw a girl standing at the edge. He recognized her. It was Agna. She stood, staring into the abyss, lost in her thoughts. Hearing footsteps, she turned and saw Richard. Her eyes were full of surprise and anxiety. "What are you doing here?" he asked, approaching her. "I could ask you the same question," she replied quietly, looking at him. Her voice trembled, and Richard realized her thoughts were as heavy as his own. "I was just walking, and my feet led me here," Richard said, looking at Agna. "I see you're troubled by something." She didn't answer immediately, as if recalling something unpleasant, then said, "You've seen my fiancé. I hate him, and tomorrow I am to be given to him." "What's there to be happy about?" she said resignedly. "I look into this abyss and think if it wouldn't be better to jump into it than to live with someone you don't like." Richard didn't know what to say to that. This world was unfair, and some people accepted it while others fought against it. He felt sorry for the girl, but there was nothing he could do. Suddenly she spoke again. "My father, though a count, has recently been losing his power bit by bit. His lands have started to bring in less income, and he has been borrowing from Baron Greaves. who has been getting richer and expanding his territories. You could say my father is selling me to him. Soon, all these lands will belong to the Greaves. I would like to run away, but I pity my father." When she finished, they heard more footsteps. Turning around, they saw Agna's brother walking towards them, loudly cursing. He approached her, grabbed her arm, and started yelling, "Why are you telling this stranger about our business? What are you doing here?" Agna didn't want to go with him and started struggling, but he dragged her along, continuing to curse. Richard was about to intervene, but then another person appeared. This time it was Count Graydon's. He approached and scolded his son. "Let her go, and don't you dare treat your sister like that again." He then turned to Richard and apologized. "I apologize for this family misunderstanding. I didn't mean to involve you in our affairs." Then, with admiration, he added, "Your skills are impressive. I would like to invite you to join my knights. We need people like you." Richard thanked him but declined. The Count nodded in understanding, then took his son and Agna, and the three of them left. Richard remained by the abyss, looking at it and feeling that something unknown emanated from it. The next day, festivities began in the village and the estate to celebrate the wedding. People rejoiced, enjoying music, food, and merriment. As the tournament winner, Richard was to accompany the bride and be her guard. So he rose early and headed to the estate. When he arrived, he was led to the main hall, where guests were already gathering. Soon the wedding procession began, moving through the village streets. People greeted the groom with joy, throwing flowers and congratulating them. But to Richard's surprise, the wedding ritual was to take place not at the estate, but at another location. The crowd led by Count Greedons moved toward the forest. Richard walked alongside other knights, guarding the procession. They walked further until they reached the very pit Richard had seen earlier. To his surprise, tents and a wooden platform had been set up here, where the wedding ceremony was to take place. Richard was astonished that all this had been built overnight, as he had been here just recently and had seen nothing like it. He couldn't understand why everything was happening here. He asked the nearest person about it, and they replied, "The Count made this decision spontaneously last night. We were surprised too." People gathered around, and the atmosphere was filled with anticipation. Baron Greaves and his son stood by the altar, next to a monk priest, a servant of the light, who was to officiate the marriage. Everyone awaited the ceremony. Soon the bride appeared with her father. Agna was dressed in a magnificent wedding gown adorned with pearls and golden threads. Her hair was neatly styled, and a tiara sparkled on her head. She looked stunning, but there was a shadow of worry in her eyes. The procession moved to the altar, and the crowd parted to make way. Everything was decorated with flowers and garlands, creating a festive atmosphere. When Agna and her father approached the altar, the priest began the ceremony. However, Agna began looking around for her brother, but he was nowhere to be seen. People in the crowd started whispering about his absence. Count Greydons, noticing this, calmly said, "Continue." The ceremony proceeded, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He looked around carefully, trying to understand what was hidden behind this strange place and the sudden decisions. The priest began reciting prayers, and when he was about to declare the marriage, Count Graydon suddenly interrupted him, raising his hand. "I need to say a few words before this marriage is concluded," he said, and his voice echoed over the crowd. The Count began to speak, and his words drew the attention of everyone present. "The Greydons family is one of the oldest in our region. We have safeguarded the peace and safety of this place for centuries. Honor and bravery have always been integral to our lineage, but unfortunately, I have proven unworthy of my ancestors. I failed to maintain the power and influence of our family, and I had to sell my own daughter to a family of lower status. For this, I am deeply ashamed. To be honest, I hate the Greaves family, but I can do nothing about their power." The Count paused, and the crowd held its breath in anticipation. "Therefore, I want to apologize to my daughter and the people of Greedens. I am canceling the wedding." There were cries of surprise and shock. Agna, standing at the altar, was both surprised and relieved by these words. Baron Greaves, however, was furious. He whispered something to his knights, and his son jumped up and grabbed the Count by the collar, shouting in his face. But then the Count unexpectedly grabbed him firmly and pushed him into the pit. The Baron's son screamed desperately as he fell, while the Baron jumped up and reached for his sword. Baron Greaves' knights began fighting with the Count's knights. Meanwhile, Count Greddens laughed, saying, "That's where you belong alongside my son, who was impure and had designs on his sister." Richard suddenly realized that the Count had thrown his own son into the pit. Panic erupted around them. People started to scatter, and fights broke out in various places. But suddenly the ground shook, and everyone froze. A terrifying howl emanated from the abyss. The sound chilled to the bone and made the blood run cold. Richard understood that something ancient and sinister was awakening in the depths of the pit. He quickly looked around, seeing the terrified faces of people staring at the abyss from which the eerie howl came. Agna stood nearby, her face full of horror and confusion. Count Greddens continued laughing, saying, "Now I can take my revenge. Finally, I will show everyone my power." Everyone watched in awe as a massive creature crawled out of the abyss. It was incredibly large, like a house, and as long as several carriages placed end to end. It was a giant centipede monster with a grotesque face resembling a human's, but covered in wrinkles with a crazed grin. Its mouth was filled with sharp teeth, and along its segmented body, human faces protruded. Richard recognized among those faces the son of the Count and the son of the Baron, along with many unfamiliar ones. He realized these were the missing people the villagers had talked about. The monster, snarling viciously, started attacking people, devouring them one by one. The knights tried to fight it, but their efforts were futile. Balthazar ran up to Richard and shouted, "We need to run! We can't handle this here!" But the knight, seeing the ordinary people, knew he had to fight. He handed Agna to the old man and ordered them to run, then gripped his sword tightly and headed toward the monster. The Count continued laughing, but his laughter abruptly stopped when the giant centipede rose and, opening its terrible mouth, devoured him. Agna screamed, "No!" But Balthazar grabbed her firmly and dragged her away, understanding that they needed to save themselves. Gathering all his resolve, Richard ran toward the giant centipede monster. He decided to immobilize it first by cutting its legs. He rushed forward and struck with his sword, but found the creature's legs were very tough and protected by thick armor. He then used moon magic, freezing the monster's legs and slowing its movement. The monster roared in pain, and Richard realized his strategy was working. Richard began striking, dodging the monster's blows as it destroyed everything around it. People screamed and scattered in panic. He slashed at the legs, freezing and breaking them one by one. But the monster was too enormous and powerful, its blows smashing everything in its path. The fight dragged on, and Richard began to feel exhausted. He took hits from the monster that knocked him off his feet. But he didn't give up, striking at the sections of the creature's body, freezing and breaking them. Then he started slashing at the faces protruding from the sides of the monster. The creature screamed in rage, and the battle grew even more intense. Suddenly he was hit hard and thrown backward. It was difficult to stand, but he tried to rise. At that moment the monster rushed at him and swallowed him whole. Richard felt himself enveloped in slime, and it made him nauseous. He tried using moon magic, but it only helped a little, slowing the creature's movement. He thought this was the end, but suddenly rage enveloped him. Red energy began flowing through his body, enveloping him more and more. He felt his strength returning and started striking from inside, cutting the monster's body. He tore a hole to the outside, ripping the creature from the inside, and crawled out, covered in slime. The red energy continued to envelop him, and he seemed to be on fire. He began to lose his sanity and entered a berserk state, attacking the monster with renewed vigor. Richard struck with incredible force, cutting off limbs and sections of the creature's body. The monster roared and tried to defend itself, but Richard was relentless. He attacked with furious rage, each strike deadly. The crowd, watching the battle, was frozen in horror and awe. In a final blow, he gathered all his strength and channeled it into his sword. The weapon glowed with a bright red light, and he chopped off the monster's head. The creature let out a final terrifying scream and collapsed to the ground, dead. Richard stood, breathing heavily, covered in slime but victorious. The red energy began to recede, and he felt himself returning to normal. The battle was over, the monster defeated. Richard sighed wearily, looking around. His first thought was to wash himself. Chaos reigned around him. People were running and screaming. Knights continued to fight. He spotted Balthazar and signaled that they needed to leave. They hurried away, making their way through the forest. Soon they found a river, and Richard, without hesitation, plunged into it fully armored, washing off the blood and slime. He tried to make sense of what had happened. It seemed the Count had been so desperate that he made such a mad decision. But it seemed to him that some other forces were involved. He remembered the mark on the knight's neck, and realized that this organization was somehow connected to all these events. Looking around, he saw Balthazar sitting on the ground nearby. The donkey stood nearby, and Enzio joyfully ran and barked. "Old man, any thoughts on this?" Richard asked. Balthazar shook his head and said, "Sometimes people's minds cloud, and they turn to darkness. I feel sorry for the Count, but there's nothing we can do. They should be grateful you dealt with that creature. The rest they must sort out themselves. I would advise you to appeal to the goddess Lunael and ask for her help. I will write to my people to send some help here." Richard nodded. After a bit of rest, they continued on their way. They had accomplished their primary task and earned money. Now Richard needed to hurry south and find a mage who could break his curse. As they walked through the forest, they heard a noise behind them. Turning around, they saw someone riding towards them. When the rider got closer, they removed their helmet, and Richard saw it was Agna. She dismounted and approached them, saying, "Are you leaving? Can I come with you?" Her eyes were filled with sadness and despair. It seemed she no longer wanted to stay at the estate. Balthazar looked at Richard, who exhaled irritably and said nothing, just continued walking through the forest. The old man smiled and turned to the girl. "Yes, of course you can join us.